Hello, I'm Kyle Warmack with the West Virginia Humanities Council. Welcome to History Alive. History Alive is a program of the Humanities Council that brings historical figures to life through first-person portrayals by presenters who have conducted thorough research into their character. The Humanities Council makes these characters available to both nonprofit and for-profit organizations across West Virginia. History Alive is designed as an interactive experience between the character and the audience. They are entertaining and educational. We encourage your organization, school, or event to host a presentation and bring a figure from history for a visit with your audience or students. Having someone like Harriet Tubman or Stonewall Jackson come to speak to your group can breathe life into these historical figures. Nothing compares to the live, in-person visit. Each presentation consists of 3 parts: a monologue, a question and answer session with the character, and then the presenter breaks character to answer questions about how he or she conducted their research. Our History Alive presenters have researched a variety of sources, such as diaries, journals, letters, official documents, autobiographies, and the research of other scholars in developing their character. A History Alive presentation is not a play. It is an audience participation event that relies on interaction between the audience and the character. Being able to ask your own questions of these important figures from the past is a unique experience. It's difficult to reproduce the feel of an actual History Alive presentation here in the studio. Without an audience to ask questions, we will change the format a bit and have our guests sit with me for a few questions after the monologue. But we hope to give a sample of how a History Alive presentation can add to your program offerings. There will be information on the screen at the end of this program for how to contact the Humanities Council about bringing a History Alive character to your community. At this time, I would like to welcome today's guest from history. We are pleased to have with us in the studio a great humanitarian, Mother Jones.
Thank you very much. But let's get one thing straight. I'm not a humanitarian, I'm a hellraiser. I belong to a class of people who have been exploited, plundered and robbed. And because I belong to that class, I have a mind to break those chains. I've traveled all over this nation, trying to create decent working conditions for textile workers and railroad workers and coal miners. I didn't come to West Virginia until 1900. At that time, I just came and watched and surveyed the situation. At that time, men were working 18 hours a day underground. They didn't get paid for the time they worked. They might work 8 or 10 hours before they loaded coal. They only got paid for the coal they loaded. And a mule was worth more than a man. If a man died underground, the company would have to simply hire another man, but if a mule died, they would have to purchase another mule. I have seen a company owner step over a dying man to inquire about the health of a mule. Men weren't paid in cash. They were paid in company money. They could only spend it at the company store. They had to go to church with a company preacher. And they were controlled by the vicious Baldwin Felts mine guards, a private army hired by the company. Vicious, amoral, immoral men that used violence to keep the control of the men. Oh, I know, my friends. I know that things have changed today. I know you get paid in cash instead of company money. I know you get a check weighman to make sure you get credit for all the coal that you've weighed and dug. But that wasn't brought around in an easy manner. That wasn't brought around by talking on a convention hall floor. It was war. War in the West Virginia hills. When I first came here, I was told you were ignorant, huddled masses, hillbillies that would work for a nickel. But when I arrived, you were on the verge of stopping work yourselves. You were not ignorant. You were proud men and women, beckoning me to swear you into the United Mine Workers of America. Nowhere have I found men and women more involved in the harsh realities of life than in these West Virginia hills. And I promise each and every one of you, when I get to heaven and I meet my Maker, I am going to tell God about medieval West Virginia and the conditions in which you live. I've seen your homes. I've seen your wives with their backs bent from work. I've seen your hungry children. And I've seen their homes, the wealthy men who control these coal mines. Their chandeliers that cost more than 5 years of your salary. They're lapdogs of their wives that eat better food than your children. And I know this now. The government of this nation is not in Washington. It is in Wall Street. So fight like hell in Congress. Oh, I needn't tell you boys, or most of you I suppose. I long ago quit praying and took to swearing. When I pray, I'll have to wait till I'm dead to get anything. But when I swear, I get things done here. So go ahead, pray for the dead, but fight like hell for the living. My friends, the corporate powers have joined together, and we must do the same thing. We must join together as men and women, blacks and whites, workers everywhere of coal mines, of factories, of textile mills. Wherever workers work, we must unite as one. My greatest victory came in 1910. The girls in the breweries up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Those girls would work from the moment they came to the work to the moment they left. They were drenched wet to the bone from washing the beer bottles. Walking home in those cold Milwaukee winters, they soon had chilblains so bad they couldn't work anymore at all and had to make their living on the street. Didn't matter, they were dead of consumption by the age of 21. All they wanted was a decent place to change clothes, away from the prying eyes of the men in the brewery. But those greedy owners would not give one carter to the factory until I called a strike of every coal miner in America not to drink one bottle of Milwaukee brewed beer until those girls got a contract. Those owners were so worried about not selling one lousy bottle of beer, they gave the girls a contract before I had to call the strike. By working together, brewery girls and coal miners, we changed the world. That was my greatest victory. My greatest defeat came right here in West Virginia, the land I had come to call home for many years. It's come to be known as the Battle of Blair Mountain. Perhaps you've heard of that. But let me tell you about the events that led up to the Battle of Blair Mountain. You see, during the Great War, coal was important to the war effort. The company and the country needed coal to make bullets and guns and tanks and such as that. And so President Wilson, the President of the United States of America, and John Mitchell, the President of the UMWA, had a no strike agreement. Coal miners would not strike while the war was on. But once the war was over, Wilson promised to create a decent contract for the men. Well, the war was over, but the Treaty of Versailles was not yet signed. And companies cut the coal miners' salaries in half and began to charge double on the market for coal. That made miners angry. They went to Wilson. He said, "Oh, the treaty's not signed. I can't get involved." He went back on his promise to us all throughout the country. Coal miners went on wildcat strikes, strikes not sanctioned by the union. But West Virginia was different. For in West Virginia, most of the coal miners lived in a coal camp, totally controlled by the company. Even their home was owned. And when they went on strike, they were evicted from their homes. One man stood up to the company. His name was Sid Hatfield, and he was a sheriff in a town called Matewan. All Sid said was this: you must abide by your own contract. You have a contract that says people have 30 days to find a new place to live. You must abide by your own contract. But those evil Baldwin Felts thugs did not pay attention. They evicted people, putting all their belongings out in a driving rain, evicting newly pregnant women just about ready to give birth or just having given birth. And so Sid and a few others met those Baldwin Felts in Matewan. It's come to be known as the Matewan Massacre. Perhaps you've heard of that. You know why it's called a massacre, don't you? Because the workers won. My friends, if the Baldwin Felts had won, it would have been called a day of justice or some such nonsense. The definition of a massacre is when innocent people who are not carrying guns are senselessly gunned down. This was no more a massacre than a shootout at the OK Corral. But the company owned the newspapers. They put out the word that it was a massacre. Sid Hatfield went to trial, but he was found innocent. And not 30 days later, Sid and his deputy, Ed Chambers, were gunned down on the steps of the McDowell County Courthouse in front of 30 witnesses, including their wives, by a man named C.E. Lively. C.E. Lively had worked his way in as a mole, pretending to be one of us when he actually worked for the company. And C.E. was never arrested and never went to trial. Blatant murder and not arrested. Sid had been the one elected official that supported the coal miners. And that made the coal miners angry. And they met in a place called Marmette outside of Charleston. I heard about this meeting where I was living in Mexico City. And I came to Marmette. And I told them to raise their guns. Their plan was to march on Logan County to Sheriff Don Chafin, a corrupt sheriff who is illegally holding union organizers without due process. And then I began to hear about the firepower being brought to bear against our boys. The West Virginia Guard, the National Guard, the U.S. militia, fresh from the trenches of France, 10,000 strong, being brought to West Virginia. I begged them not to march. I even read a telegram given to me by President Harding saying if they didn't march, he would negotiate a truce. They didn't believe me and asked me to produce the telegram. I had thrown it away long ago. And they marched. And on their way, Bill Blizzard, the leader of the march, was stopped and told they would be committing treason against the American government if they marched. Now, our boys are patriotic boys. They love their country. They had no plans of overthrowing the government. They simply wanted justice for coal miners. And they met at a ball diamond in Madison, in Boone County. And they decided to stop marching. And when the U.S. militia found out they had stopped, they went on a shooting spree and killed women and children for joy in a town called Sharples. Now that is a massacre, and you don't read about it in the history book. Well, the miners reformed, and they met that army on Blair Mountain. Americans, fighting Americans. How do you know who your enemy is and who your brother is? And so our boys put on red bandanas. If you hear the word redneck today, you wear that title with pride, for that's where it comes from. But they couldn't fight. They couldn't fight 10,000, an army of 10,000. Gatling guns and grenades fought against them. They even tested a new piece of equipment. At the time they called it an aeroplane, but today you would call it a helicopter. The first time a helicopter was used in warfare was by the U.S. militia against West Virginia coal miners. Finally, they surrendered and were brought back to Charleston. And they were cheering. For they thought that now the American government would recognize their plight. Over 800 were indicted for treason. 12 only went to trial, and 3 were found guilty. And then Bill Blizzard was indicted for murder. And that trial moved throughout West Virginia, till finally in Fayette County, in the courthouse that stands there today, he was found innocent. Innocent. My friends, the struggle of the workers through the ages has been that of blood. It has been that of hunger. And today we are reaching our final crisis. And when this crisis is over, humanity must be free. There must be no robber class and no working class. Every American benefits from the blood and the bravery of the union movement. I hear about things where I am. 40-hour week, vacation benefits, workers' compensation. Whether or not you belong to a union, these things weren't given to you by the corporate powers. They were fought for by union workers for you throughout this nation, and it is your heritage, as much as the American Revolution is your heritage. Now, my boys, you are mine. We have fought together. And we have hungered together. And we have marched together. But I see victory in the heavens for you. I see God's hand guiding you and inspiring you. No white flag! We must not raise it. We must redeem the world. We must get together and stay together. And when the enemies of this organization lie moldering in the grave, and the world has forgotten that they ever lived, your work and your union must live. You must be the heroes of today, and your work will be the legends of tomorrow.
As we mentioned at the top of the show, it's difficult to replicate the unique experience of a History Alive question and answer session without a live audience, but I'm lucky enough to have that opportunity today. So please join me in welcoming our guest, Mother Jones.
Hello there, dear.
Thank you for having us. Now, I have to ask, why are you called Mother Jones?
Well, you know, many of us were given familial names like that. The company would try to say, oh, there's a woman who wants to be around men. She must be that kind of woman. I would be in my 60s and 70s, mind you. But at any rate, they would besmirch our reputations. And so to overcome that negativity, we were called aunt or mother or sister. You know, and I wasn't the only one. There was Mother Blizzard. John Blizzard's mother was called Mother Blizzard. And then there was Aunt Molly Jackson and Sister Fannie Lou Hamer, or names like, there was a young woman on Cabin Creek named Nellie Spinelli, and she was so influenced by me, she swore a lot. They started calling her Dirty Nellie. But for the most part, they gave us names like aunt or mother or sister as a way to show their endorsement of us and to take away any negative connotations from the company trying to besmirch our names.
I see. Well, you gave a number of West Virginia examples there, and you were deeply involved in the unionization effort in West Virginia's coal fields. How did labor conditions in West Virginia compare to what you were seeing in the rest of the country from 1900 to 1925?
Well, they were, you know, certainly the working conditions were terrible everywhere, but the biggest difference with West Virginia is that 90% of the West Virginia coal miners lived in a coal camp. The closest to that was Illinois with 50%. That meant every other state in the Union, over that, at least most of the coal miners could own their own house, were paid in cash, could buy a car, could live their own lives. West Virginia, but I'm also talking about Eastern Kentucky, Western Virginia, and Western Pennsylvania. That's this section here. This area was dominated by that coal camp phenomena. And it was not that way in the rest of the country. In Iowa, they lived in their own homes. That is a major difference. And so they could, if they wanted to go on strike or they wanted to change jobs, they didn't have to leave their home. And the fact that the West Virginia companies, well, they said that the place was so mountainous, they had to bring people together and create the towns, but they really had a firm control over the men. They couldn't go on strike. There was a man that told me that once his family brought him groceries, produce from the family farm, he was not permitted company for 3 months because he didn't shop at the company store. That kind of control was different in West Virginia.
I see. Well, speaking of that kind of involvement and workers' methods of fighting that type of control, you were involved, in addition to the Battle of Blair Mountain, which you mentioned earlier, you were also involved in the Cabin Creek strikes, 1912, 1913. From your perspective, what was different about those two situations?
Well, for one thing, in 1912 and 13, I went to jail. It wasn't the first time I went to jail. The first time ever was in Fairmont, West Virginia. And I was asked to be put in jail with my boys, but I was taken to Parkersburg, and I met before the judge, who called me the most dangerous woman in America, and said that if I went to jail, I'd be a martyr. Well, that gave me an idea. And I got to work getting in jail as much as I could. If I talked to a coal miner, the only one who heard me was a coal miner, but if I went to jail, I could get news in the newspaper. And so the longest I was ever in jail was in Pratt in 1913. And that was one of the big differences. But I would say the other difference was the Blair Mountain had more of a national scope. Across the nation, people had their eyes on it. In Cabin Creek, we were just fighting locally. We only heard locally. That would be the difference.
I see. Now, something you mentioned when you were talking about the Battle of Blair Mountain was a telegram from President Harding. But you mentioned that you had forgotten.
I threw it away.
I see. What did it feel like when you were trying to convince the miners not to march and you didn't have the real thing in your hands?
Well, I was heartbroken they didn't believe me. I thought they would at least take me at my word, knowing I could see what was happening. I could see that all these soldiers coming back from the war, fighting. How could we be fighting soldiers who had risked their lives in France? I mean, that would be terrible publicity, if nothing else. And so I knew that it was going to be a problem, and it was. After the Battle of Blair Mountain, Union membership dropped drastically because of the terrible publicity we got from that event.
Mm-hmm. Now, you're known primarily for your fight for union rights. Were you also involved in any way in women's suffrage at this time?
I was not involved in women's suffrage. The women's suffrage movement is supported by wealthy women. And I think that God made women and Rockefeller made ladies. I want nothing to do with those women. But also, I do believe that bottom is bottom. If you can't live, how can you even be worried about voting? You better to raise hell than raise the right to vote.
I see. Strong feelings on this matter.
Strong feelings on everything, young man.
Now, returning back to West Virginia, your agitation in the state brought you into contact with a few different of West Virginia governors. What were your impressions and interactions with?
Well, there were some that were good and most that were not. There was that Governor Glasscock. He was the one during 1912. I took 100 miners, and we stood outside his window, and I declared war on the state of West Virginia. I did have a special name for him, but perhaps we won't go into that here. Some people know it already. But then there was Governor Hatfield. When I was, he replaced Glasscock during the course of that 1912 and 13 strike, and he was had been a physician, and he came to see me. When I was a young woman, I was exposed to yellow fever. My family all died from them. I had 4 children and a husband that died from yellow fever when I was living in Memphis, Tennessee, and so, but I obviously developed some sort of immunity to it, but my lungs were never that good again because of having that terrible condition as a young woman. And so I was very sick when I was in prison. I was very sick when I was in prison in Colorado, but Governor Hatfield came to see me and he set me free because he could see how sick that I was being in that house in Pratt. There wasn't a jail. They had a bullpen outside with but they kept all the men that they arrested, but they put me in a house there in Pratt. But Governor Hatfield, so I could say good things about him. He saw that I was, he really did seek to negotiate the truce for that strike as well. So there were good ones and there were bad ones.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us, Mother Jones. And welcome to the show, Karen.
Oh, well, thank you. All right.
You've got quite a backstory with Mother Jones. You and her go way back. Can you give us some insights into how you came to portray Mother Jones originally?
Well, originally, it was 1989. I was 4. No, I'm kidding. The UMWA went on strike against Pittston. And I was already performing a play called Coal Camp Memories, and they knew people had seen me do that and asked if I would perform Mother Jones at some strikes. And I hadn't even known who she was. I had heard of the magazine. I just thought she was sort of a Paul Bunyan character. And I looked into her, and they actually hired a writer for me, a man named Bob Dameron, a very wonderful writer and musician. And Bob Dameron and Jim Martin, another wonderful musician in the state, traveled with me. And we went to a number of rallies, a number of UMWA rallies. And I did about a 10-minute speech as Mother Jones. And then I went to Wise, Virginia, and I was the warm-up speaker for Cesar Chavez, a very high point in my life. And I was introduced to her that way. And it was very exciting to be part of the whole, it was a very large national strike with Pittston, with the UMWA against Pittston. So just very shortly after that, the West Virginia Humanities Council put out a call for characters. And I thought, well, I've just been studying Mother Jones, and I submitted for her, and I was on the first roster in 1990, I think it was.
Yes, all the way back to the beginning.
That's right.
So this character is your longest running Chautauqua-style character, as I understand
I have 14 others that I do, 14 total that I do.
You could run a roster all your own.
Okay.
But, so you've been doing it for so long. What do you think keeps Mother Jones relevant through all these years?
Well, you know, do we have justice still? I mean, the workers still are asking for justice and fair pay, and women are still paid less than men, and there's still so many relevant issues around the world. And Mother Jones' passion for the average working person to have a decent life is a universal story. And I think her the language she uses is so empowering, and it gives me a thrill to do her.
What are some of your most important historical sources for bringing her to life, especially her involvement here in West Virginia?
There's a number of really good autobiographies. There's certainly there's the Dale Featherling one, was the one classic for years. There's an Elliot Gorn wrote a book maybe 10 years ago now. And that's a fairly new autobiography. There's a number of books about her. And there was a woman in Beckley named Lois McLean who was a really fine historian. Never got around to writing her book before she passed. But she also, and I worked with her a lot, she actually had a recording of Mother Jones' voice that I got to hear. Mother Jones was born in Ireland, but she came when she was about 6, they think. She has just that little hint of an accent, and I don't. It's not super broad, but it's just enough that you can hear it. So I was able to hear her voice. And then of course there was a professor at WVU, Steele, that wrote 2 important books. One is the Correspondence of Mother Jones, and one's the Speeches of Mother Jones. And so those are her words, which is wonderful. If I can do anything first person, I will, the best I can.
Mm-hmm. And what are some of the most common questions you get asked when you portray Mother Jones?
I always get asked, how do you travel? How do you go about the country? Like, well, by railroad and by horse and wagon and by foot. I mean, I would say that I knew people had occasionally an automobile, but she wouldn't have known many people that had automobiles, but occasionally automobiles. But sometimes if she knew that she would have a welcoming committee at a railroad station, and by that I mean not welcoming her, going to put her back on the train, she would get off a stop early and walk in over the mountain. All railroad stops are 20 miles apart, or they were. That's pretty standard. So she would walk in the 20 miles to avoid being arrested when she got to the place. So, she did, of course, took a boat over here from Ireland and then went back to Europe and did some studying of labor there. So she took a steamer. So she mostly traveled by railroad, though, and horse and buggy.
Mm-hmm. Well, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today,
Thank
Karen.
you so much for having me, Kyle.
If your organization is interested in hosting a History Alive presentation, call the number on your screen or visit wvhumanities.org for more information. Thank you.